Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to another session under our knowledge series. Today we are going to take up a discussion on a very important topic from Environment and Ecology, and we are going to discuss the Paris Agreement that has been signed under the Climate Change Convention. We are bringing this topic to you as a follow-up to the discussion on Kyoto Protocol that we had in one of our earlier sessions. We are having this discussion based on popular demand. Many of you were requesting for a session on Paris Agreement following the discussion on Kyoto Protocol. So if you want more such sessions, do let us know in the comment section. You'll have to comment more and let us know which topics you would like to listen in the next 2 weeks. So today let's start with our discussion on the Paris Agreement, which is a part of the Climate Change Convention. The Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015, it happens to be the first ever universal legally binding global agreement under the Climate Change Convention. That is, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the 21st summit took place, the 21st Conference of Parties took place at Paris in 2015. During this summit, there was a lot of expectation to come up with a new agreement which could replace the Kyoto Protocol. As we had discussed in a previous session, Kyoto Protocol was the only binding agreement we had under the Climate Change Convention. The Kyoto Protocol was signed back in 1997, but however, it was implemented only for a very short period between 2008 and 2012. This was the first phase of implementation of the Kyoto Protocol. Under the Kyoto Protocol, a few countries, they had been given binding targets, especially the developed industrialized nations. They had been given binding targets, and developing and underdeveloped countries were being assisted by the developed nations to achieve their climate action goals. After the first phase of Kyoto Protocol expired, the world did not have a climate change agreement. So to deal with global warming and climate change and to tackle the risk posed by greenhouse gas emissions, the Kyoto Protocol itself was extended for a second phase, which was supposed to be implemented between 2012 and 2020. This was the upgraded version of the Kyoto Protocol. But however, even this wasn't sufficient because it didn't contain enough provisions to tackle the threat of global warming effectively and efficiently. Hence, the need was felt for a new agreement that could replace the Kyoto Protocol. So at the 21st Conference of Parties held at Paris, finally, a binding agreement was worked out, which is today referred to as the Paris Agreement. So this agreement has received almost universal acceptance. It was signed by all the parties, by 196 member states who were party to the convention, and it was ratified by more than 190 countries, and it entered into force in 2016. So within 1 year of its adoption and signing, the treaty was brought into force and it replaced the Kyoto Protocol. So that is why the Paris Agreement is so very important to understand, especially with regard to climate action. This agreement, it hopes to push the countries to reduce their emissions, to tackle the greenhouse gas emissions, in order to ensure that we don't cross the danger mark when it comes to rising temperatures, which is a direct result of the greenhouse gas emissions that we are emitting into the atmosphere. So its primary purpose is to bring down emissions, to limit global warming and to keep it under the dangerous levels where climate change might become irreversible. It also has long-term goals and targets to push the countries to achieve a climate neutral world, that is to push towards net zero emissions, where the emissions are balanced with the amount of greenhouse gases being absorbed or removed from the atmosphere. So Paris Agreement lays focus on both reduction of emissions, that is reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and also on achieving a climate neutral world or achieving net zero emissions by the middle of this century, by 2050. So that is why this agreement is very, very important with regard to climate action, because it is legally binding and more or less it has been universally accepted and ratified. Under this agreement, a few targets have been taken up. There are few primary focus areas. The first target of Paris Agreement is to ensure that the global rise in temperatures is kept limited to under 2 degrees Celsius, and if possible, to limit and keep the global rise in temperatures under 1.5 degrees Celsius by the middle of this century. By 2050, the goal is to keep the rise in temperatures to under 2 degrees Celsius, and by the end of the century, by 2100, the goal is to keep the global rise in temperatures to under 1.5 degrees Celsius. Because beyond this, any rise in temperature beyond this mark is deemed to be dangerous and climate change could become irreversible. This will increase extreme weather events. We are already witnessing increasing frequency and magnitude of extreme weather events that is leading to many disasters around the world. In the last 10-15 years itself, we have noted an increase in forest fires, extreme rains, floods, etc. So such extreme weather events are going to further increase in their frequency and magnitude if the global rise in temperatures are not kept under this danger mark. In fact, due to industrial development over the last 150-200 years, due to our burning of fossil fuels, we have emitted a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and that has already pushed up the global average temperatures. So now the goal is to limit those emissions, try and remove some of the excess greenhouse gas present in the atmosphere so that we can limit the rise in temperatures to under 2 degrees by the middle of this century. And in a best possible scenario, the Paris Agreement hopes to push the countries to limit the rise in temperature to under 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. It also aims to help the weak countries, the vulnerable countries, to build resilience against climate change and against the impact of disasters. Especially developing underdeveloped nations, the small island states and the least developed countries, they are at the highest risk of getting affected by climate change. So to help them become resilient, to help them implement adaptation and mitigation measures, the Paris Agreement lays down a path so that these vulnerable countries can be protected against the impact of climate change. It also pushes the developed countries and the global financial institutions to provide for financing, to provide financial support to the developing underdeveloped countries so that they can make use of the funds to invest in clean and renewable energy. They can also make use of the funds to adapt to the consequences of climate change and also to mitigate the damage that will be caused by increasing frequency of disasters. So these are the focus areas, the priority areas of Paris Agreement. One is to keep the global rise in temperatures to under 2 degrees or if possible under 1.5 degrees. Second, to help vulnerable countries to implement adaptation mitigation measures to make them resilient against disasters and climate change. And finally, to arrange financing, to provide funding from developed nations towards developing countries so that they will have the financial support to take all these climate action measures. Now let's go a little in detail with regard to the key points and provisions of the Paris Agreement. As you know, the goal is to limit the rise in temperatures by the middle of this century and by the end of this century. So the world is working towards keeping the rise in temperatures under 2 degrees and if possible to under 1.5 degrees. But the question is, how can this be achieved? How can this ambitious target be achieved and how will countries reduce their emissions? So what is the mechanism being followed here? What is the path being adopted? So that is something you need to understand. First and foremost, the Paris Agreement pushes the developed countries to work on their financing commitments. Previously, when we discussed the Kyoto Protocol, we did mention climate financing. So under the Kyoto arrangement, the developed countries had promised $100 billion to be provided to developing underdeveloped nations every year to help combat climate change. But this fund has never materialized. The rich countries, the developed industrialized nations, they haven't fulfilled this commitment till date. So that is something Paris Agreement concentrates on. It pushes the developed countries to realize this financing and increase the promised amount so that the required financial support is there for the weaker nations to focus on their climate action goals. So financing is a priority area. It has few specific provisions to increase climate financing between 2020 and 2025 which constitutes the first phase of implementation of the Paris Agreement. So when it's being implemented for the 5 years between 2020 and 2025, developed nations have to pool their financial resources and ensure that they live up to this commitment and provide these funds to the developing underdeveloped nations. So that is a focus area. Next, it does account for differentiated responsibilities. Again, if you go back to our discussion on Kyoto Protocol, I had told you that under the Kyoto Protocol, a key principle was adopted, which was the CBDR principle. CBDR stands for Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. According to this principle of Kyoto Protocol, the developed countries which are responsible for historical emissions, which have emitted greenhouse gases from decades, from almost more than 1 century, they were held accountable and they were given historical responsibilities. Meaning they had to do more, take more targets, take binding targets to bring down their emissions and also assist the developing underdeveloped nations. So under CBDR principle, historical emissions and historical responsibilities were accounted for. This was legally binding on the developed world and the industrialized nations, and they had to try and achieve these binding targets. On the other hand, the developing and underdeveloped countries, which are not responsible for historical emissions, they had been exempted from binding targets. They had no binding targets on them. They could just focus on reducing their emissions as per their national capabilities, and they just had to focus on adapting and mitigating to the consequences of climate change. They didn't have any binding targets on them under the previous Kyoto Protocol. They weren't specified any clear targets, and they could take whatever action as they wanted with the help of developed nations. The developed nations were mandated to provide finance and technology, to provide the funds and the technological assistance to help these countries to switch towards clean energy. So this is what the Kyoto Protocol provided for. But the Paris Agreement is very different from the Kyoto Protocol over here. It does not have the CBDR principle. It does not explicitly mention the CBDR principle or common but differentiated responsibilities. Previously, Kyoto Protocol, it had recognized fighting climate change as a common goal, but the responsibilities had been differentiated. The differentiation was on the basis of historical emissions of each country. But Paris Agreement does not make any such distinction. It does not explicitly mention the CBDR principle, but it does include a differentiation. It does differentiate between the developed and developing nations. So under the Paris Agreement, the climate action targets are supposed to be achieved by every country. Every country is expected to strive towards achieving these targets, and the targets are not given by the agreement. Previously, Kyoto Protocol specified the targets that, let's say a developed country, let's say like UK or Canada or US, these countries, they were given binding emission targets. They had to keep their emissions within the prescribed target. But in Paris Agreement, you don't have such binding targets. Every country has to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they have to come out with their own voluntary targets. This is the big difference. Kyoto Protocol prescribed the binding targets on the developed nations. Paris Agreement does not do that. It expects every country to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but the targets will be determined by the countries themselves. So these voluntary targets are known as NDCs or INDCs. It stands for Nationally Determined Contributions or Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, meaning every country will decide for itself as to what emission reduction target it will set for itself. So based on these voluntary commitments, every country is supposed to switch towards cleaner energy and reduce emissions. So here, there is a distinction between the developed and developing nations. Developed countries are expected to do more. Industrialized countries, which are responsible for historical emissions, they are expected to take much stricter targets as compared to developing underdeveloped nations. So let me sum up this point. The path to achieving this target, the ambitious target of Paris Agreement, is left to each country. Every country will come out with its voluntary targets known as nationally determined contributions or intended nationally determined contributions. There are no binding targets on any country, but the developed countries are expected to take more stricter targets. The goal here is to ensure that we not just reduce emissions in the coming decades, but also try and achieve net zero emissions. To move towards net zero emissions, at least by the middle of the century, by 2050. Later, I'll explain what exactly does it mean by net zero emissions. So by reducing emissions and by removing existing greenhouse gases, the world is being pushed towards net zero emissions by the Paris Agreement. That is the key focus of this agreement. It does provide for sharing of burden. The Paris Agreement pushes the developed countries to share finances and technology with the developing countries. The developed countries are expected to share their advanced technologies in the field of clean renewable energy and help the developing underdeveloped nations to meet their respective national targets. But the best part about Paris Agreement is that it provides for a transparent and a verifiable review mechanism. This was missing in the Kyoto Protocol. In Kyoto Protocol, there were binding targets. There were mechanisms to achieve those targets, but it did not have an efficient and transparent review mechanism. The Paris Agreement is different over here. It provides for a review mechanism through which the progress of the countries can be reviewed. The Climate Change Convention can review whether the countries are seriously progressing or moving towards their respective voluntary targets. So Paris Agreement commitments will be implemented for 5 years in the first phase, between 2020 and 2025. After the first phase of implementation, there will be a review, a thorough review will be held, which will be transparent and verifiable, and the progress of the countries will be tracked, and based on that, more ambitious targets will be taken up. So Paris Agreement has provided for a review mechanism which was missing under the Kyoto Protocol. Then finally, another important provision is that Paris Agreement recognizes the impact of climate damage on the vulnerable nations. It acknowledges the fact that small countries, island nations, least developed countries, they are at greater risk of being affected by climate change. It acknowledges the seriousness of climate damage that could be suffered by the weaker countries and provides recognition for that. So it means the developed nations, the big countries, rich, powerful countries, they have to take the ownership to help out these vulnerable nations. They have to take this as a moral obligation because they are the ones who are responsible for historical emissions, and they need to provide funds and technology and help these countries in whatever manner possible so that every country can achieve its voluntary targets. So this is what is different about the Paris Agreement. So to implement these voluntary targets and to put in place a review mechanism, the Katowice Rulebook was brought out by the Climate Change Convention in 2018. It was in 2018 when the 24th Conference of Parties to the Climate Change Convention was being held at Poland. A rule book was brought out called the Katowice Rulebook. Katowice was the city where the 24th Conference of Parties was being held in Poland. So during this summit of the Climate Change Convention in 2018, a set of rules and guidelines were adopted to provide for operationalizing the Paris Agreement. To ensure that Paris Agreement is implemented from 2020 to 2025, and to ensure that the review process is put in place, a rule book was brought out which contains all the rules, the procedures and the guidelines. This is known as the Katowice Rulebook, adopted at the Katowice Summit in 2018. It covers all aspects of climate action. It covers financing, mitigation efforts, adaptation, and puts in place a transparent, verifiable review mechanism. By providing funds and by providing technology, The weaker countries, they can really focus on mitigation and adaptation. Now, what exactly do you mean by mitigation and adaptation? Mitigation refers to reducing the impact of climate change, reducing the impact of disasters which might increase as a result of climate change, helping the countries to cope with the impact of rising sea levels, the impact of erratic weather which might lead to floods, droughts, etc. So mitigation focuses on reducing the impact, reducing the damage. Adaptation focuses on creating a buffer so that future societies can withstand the impact of climate change. You can take certain preventive precautionary measures to guard yourself against the impact of rising sea levels, rising temperatures, and erratic extreme weather patterns. So that is why the smaller countries need assistance. They need technology in many different domains. They need specialization in disaster management. They need specialization in containing the impact of certain disasters, such as floods, rising sea levels, or forest fires, droughts, etc. Certain countries, they are already pioneers in this field. So they can share their technology, their resources, and also provide funds to those countries which don't have these resources. So the focus is on mitigation and adaptation. That is to reduce the impact and to start coping with the impact, to create a buffer through which you can shield yourself from the impact of these extreme weather events. So the Katowice Rulebook covers all these aspects of climate action. It also allows for long-term targets to be given out by the countries. Apart from the binding voluntary targets they take up, apart from the binding voluntary targets they are going to announce, countries can even take up long-term goals and long-term targets so that they can achieve net zero emissions at least by the middle of this century. So all these guidelines, the procedures regarding how the agreement will be operationalized, how exactly it will be implemented, how will the progress of the countries be tracked and verified. So all those protocols, procedures are laid down under the Katowice Rulebook. This rulebook lays down a tracking mechanism, a review mechanism called Enhanced Transparency Framework. It puts in place the Enhanced Transparency Framework through which countries will report their progress. Every country which has taken up NDCs, nationally determined contributions, they are expected to voluntarily report their progress starting from 2024. So a transparent process has been put in place for this, and every country has to share the data with the Climate Change Convention. They have to share it with the world, and from 2024, they will be held accountable for their progress. If they are lacking, they will have to scale up their initiatives. They will have to focus more on climate action efforts. Or they may have to come up with renewed targets which are more ambitious, and they have to tell the world how they are going to achieve those targets. So that is what the review mechanism does. So to verify the progress of the countries and to check whether countries are genuinely progressing towards achieving their voluntary binding targets, an enhanced transparency framework is being put in place. The data so collected will be part of a global stockpile, and all the countries can review the progress of the other countries. They can hold the other countries accountable for their performance, especially the top emitters, the top 20, 30 emitters. They will be held accountable by the world through this review mechanism. See, today, the top emitters are China, the United States, European Union, then India. These are the top 4 greenhouse gas emitters. This is likely to continue for a few more years, and India is expected to jump up the table as we are going to witness more economic growth and development. So we will continue burning fossil fuels for at least a few more decades before we make a larger transition towards clean and renewable energy. So as India and other countries are expected to emit more greenhouse gas emissions, then as China, US, and other developed European countries are expected to sustain their high greenhouse gas emissions, it's very, very important that there is a thorough review mechanism in place. So that is why the Enhanced Transparency Framework has been brought out. It's very much part of the Katowice Rulebook, and it allows the countries to hold the top emitters accountable. through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The United Nations and the countries, the member countries, they can hold the top emitters accountable and review whether they are genuinely progressing towards achieving their targets. So based on this review in 2025, the second set of goals will be adopted. A new set of ambitious targets and goals will be adopted following the first phase of implementation of the Paris Agreement. So even India is very much actively involved in this process. In fact, India has been very responsible when it comes to climate change and climate action. When the 21st Conference of Parties took place in 2015 at Paris, India was a very active participant. We worked very closely with France during these negotiations, and India played a key role in finalizing the Paris Agreement. In fact, we just didn't bring out the Paris Agreement. We even worked with France to bring out a very important initiative in the field of clean renewable energy known as the International Solar Alliance. It was India which proposed the International Solar Alliance to exploit the solar potential of the tropical belt so that these tropical countries in particular, the sunshine countries, they can move towards solar energy, which is clean and renewable as compared to dirty fossil fuels. So India has been taking concrete steps in this regard, and India has announced its INDCs. It has brought out its intended nationally determined contributions through its National Climate Action Plan. Through the National Climate Action Plan, India has announced its set of targets, its voluntary binding targets. The first target is to reduce the emission intensity, the intensity of emissions, to bring it down to 33 to 35%. To reduce emissions intensity by 33 to 35% by the end of this decade as compared to emissions in 2005. That is, compared to 2005 level emissions, we hope to bring down our emissions intensity year on year by at least 33 to 35% by the end of this decade, that is by 2030. India has also taken a very big commitment to shift towards non-fossil fuel based sources for electricity generation. We are making a huge transition in our energy basket. We are shifting away from fossil fuels, moving more towards clean renewable energy, and India is committed that it will generate at least 40% of its electricity through non-fossil fuel sources by 2030. Also, please note, these two targets have already been updated and revised by India, because India is well on track to achieve the first two targets. We are very likely to achieve both the targets very soon by 2030 itself. So India has already taken up a higher target even before 2025. During last year's Glasgow summit of the Climate Change Convention, Prime Minister Modi announced that India is scaling up its climate action targets. The voluntary binding targets have been scaled up. So today, India is looking at reducing its emission intensity by 45%. 45%, not just 33 or 35%. So the emission intensity reduction target has been scaled up. And the Prime Minister also announced that India is going to have 50% of its electricity being generated through non-fossil sources, not just 40%. The Prime Minister has laid out a plan to ensure that India achieves an installed capacity of 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. Now, this is a very, very ambitious target for India, because as of now, the installed capacity of renewable energy in India is around 50 gigawatts. So we need to install another 450 gigawatts of energy capacity, and that should be sourced from non-fossil fuel sources. That includes solar, hydropower, wind power, and also nuclear. Electricity generated through nuclear sources. So this ambitious target has been brought out by India. It's an upgradation of the previous targets that we had. And the third and final target for India is to create a massive carbon sink to promote carbon absorption. That is to remove excess greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. India is committed to increase its forest cover and tree cover through afforestation, through conservation of its forests, and to ensure that at least 2.5 to 3 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions are absorbed by India's green cover. This is one target where India is yet to make some progress. Even though we are reporting a slight increase in our forest cover, it is still unlikely to help India to meet this ambitious target. So India will have to focus on bringing down deforestation, focus more on afforestation measures to increase its forest and tree cover so that we can create a natural carbon sink that can naturally remove or sequester a few billion tons of greenhouse gases every year. Right now, there is a lot of focus on carbon sequestration and also on creating carbon sinks, because the world is being pushed by Paris Agreement to focus on net zero emissions. I told you I'll explain what exactly does it mean by net zero emissions. Net zero emissions means that you're going to equate or balance out the emissions with the greenhouse gases that are being removed or being absorbed from the atmosphere. The forests, they themselves are a natural carbon sink. The oceans, they are a natural carbon sink. So by protecting your environment and biodiversity, you can increase the potential of our forests and oceans to absorb and sequester more and more carbon and greenhouse gases. So along with reducing emissions on one side, there is focus on increasing carbon sinks and also on adopting carbon sequestration technologies. Today there are technologies through which greenhouse gases can be captured from the atmosphere, thereby removing a percentage of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So this will help in curbing global warming, and the carbon which is sequestered can be stored away in natural carbon sinks. There are many different advanced futuristic technologies that are coming up with carbon sequestration. So countries are focusing on this so that someday in the near future, we can balance out our total emissions with total absorption of greenhouse gases. So in net terms, you will have zero emissions, and this is what will help us to move towards a climate neutral world. In fact, many countries have already done that. Countries like Bhutan, for example. Bhutan is a pioneer. Bhutan happens to be a pioneer when it comes to focusing on climate action efforts. It's already a carbon negative country because of its focus on carbon sequestration. Countries like Suriname in Latin America, it has very minimal economic activities, barely any emissions, so it is already a carbon negative nation. But there are others who are major emitters, but they are taking these targets to focus on net zero emissions by 2050. Countries like Norway, Scandinavian countries which are more responsible towards environment and climate, they have taken ambitious targets through a proposed law. They're trying to bring out a law or a policy through which they'll try to achieve net neutrality or net zero emissions by 2030. There are countries which are working on the target by 2035, 2040, etc. Mostly it's European countries which are focusing on net zero emissions. The European Union is considering a separate law so that by 2050 Europe can become a region of net zero emissions. The United States, on the other hand, has committed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. China also has done the same, but it has taken a much prolonged target of 2060 as it is not responsible for historical emissions. India was one of the last major emitters to take up the net zero emission target, and India has announced that it will achieve net zero emissions by 2070, almost 20 years after other developed countries, because we are not largely responsible for historical emissions. India still needs a space, a window to focus on economic growth and development, and that would require burning of fossil fuels. But parallelly, we are focusing on cleaner energies, renewable energy, to bring down our emissions, to create a large carbon sink, and also to shift towards cleaner energy. So this is how the world is progressing towards net zero emissions, hopefully by 2050. And the Paris Agreement is central to all these targets, and this is the hope for mankind to bring down emissions, to keep temperatures within manageable levels so that climate change doesn't reach an irreversible position. So on this note, I would like to conclude this discussion. Now let's see if there are any questions. Shubham is asking, are the developed countries going for zero carbon emissions? See, achieving zero carbon emissions may not be practical. No country would try to even focus on that goal, Because some way or the other, there will be carbon emissions, both naturally and as well as through anthropogenic activities, through industrial activities. So emissions will be there, but the goal is to bring it down, keep it within manageable levels, and focus on carbon sinks and carbon sequestration so that excess greenhouse gases can be removed and absorbed. Next, what's the relation and difference between UNFCCC and Paris Agreement? Actually, there's no difference. See, Climate Change Convention is a platform that was created in 1990s through the Rio Earth Summit. It is under the Climate Change Convention that climate change negotiations are taking place. So under Climate Change Convention, there have been two agreements. One is the Kyoto Protocol and the second one is the Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement is the outcome of Climate Change Convention. So they are not different. It's a part of it. Every year there is a climate change summit that takes place. So countries use this platform to negotiate and discuss, and they come out with these agreements and protocols to help them achieve the climate action targets. The first agreement was Kyoto Protocol under Climate Change Convention. The second one is Paris Agreement. Next, Gyan Krishna is asking, how come a voluntary target is a binding target? See, voluntary target can be a binding target. Now, for example, let's say I'm a civil service aspirant. I give myself a goal that I should ensure that I'll be in the top 100. That's a voluntary target I'm giving to myself. But it can be made binding. Let's say my parents say that I have to achieve a rank within top 100 at any cost. So that is a binding target on me. But the target was taken up by me. It's a voluntary target which was made binding by an authority. So that is what Paris Agreement does. Countries take up their voluntary targets. They will determine what emission reduction they can achieve, as to what extent they can shift to clean and renewable energy, to what extent they can invest in carbon sinks and carbon sequestration. So every country can decide this on their own. But once they determine the target, submit the targets to the UN, it becomes binding on them. The agreement makes it legally binding on them. Next, is there any accountability mechanism for this agreement? Yes, we just discussed that. The Katowice Rulebook provides for the rules and procedures, and a transparency framework is also part of it that provides for review and accountability. Okay, so these were the questions. So on this note, let me bring this discussion to an end. I hope you've learned something fruitful about the Paris Agreement and Climate Change Convention. So do let me know how the session went. Press the like button if you liked it. Share your comments. Let us know which topics you would like us to cover in the coming sessions. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.